I think people have different ways of going about different startups, and everyone's journey is a little bit different. Mine already, I think you're kind of getting the sense that I was a little bit like not planned from day one. Like I didn't come to Vietnam with the idea to do this, and I kind of fell into it. But the other thing, when I reflect on it, it's like why a startup. I think it's like finding a startup is maybe not so different than achieving mastery in anything. And for example, like how do you become a great podcaster? How do you become a great author or artist? There's a saying that's you say just stay on the bus. Meaning like if you think about how a bus lines work in a city, imagine you're in the middle of the city. You stay on the bus, and for the first first half an hour or so, first 10 stops, they're all the same. So you go to the same places. Everything's very similar. So, for example, you're starting a company or starting a podcast. It's not nothing special really happens in that first little phase. But you stay on the bus long enough, and eventually, like they filter out, and you get farther and farther away, and you start to get to places that no one else can go to.
Welcome to the MHV podcast. We speak with leading founders, VCs, and operators on their journey in Southeast Asia. Learn more at www.monkshill.com. Hey Charles, really excited to have you on the MHV podcast. You are building out something truly amazing, which is really helping so many people really get that education that they need to have to get to the next stage in their life. And you also happen to be another alumnus of UC Berkeley, so go Bears. Hey, welcome aboard. I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Yeah, long-time listener, first-time contributor. It's an honor to be here, Jeremy. My name is Charles. I'm the co-founder CEO of CoderSchool, online coding school based in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam.
Amazing. So I've got to ask, what were you like back at UC Berkeley? Were you very hippie? Did you ever own a tie-dye shirt? Or were you very much a computer science degree, inside the basement?
Wow, so it was a long time ago now. But yeah, actually, I was a little bit less hippie than that. I would say that there was a lot of time in the basement. So at Berkeley, like the computer labs in the basement where there's no windows, just dark all the time. So I spent a couple nights in that basement before. But overall, I would say one thing I think about a lot is, yeah, Berkeley was full of kind of tie-dye hippies types, but really more than that, it was about somewhere where people were unafraid to be themselves. So, for example, we used to have this guy on campus who would dress up in like a pink bodysuit from head to toe, just in like pink spandex, and ride around on a unicycle and do stuff. And that was like kind of normal. Like you'd see the guy, we'd wave. And I think about that frequently because actually I think Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon, as we call it here, is a little bit similar in that people are really like unafraid to express themselves. Just the other day, I saw a guy in the park with pet squirrels here. I thought, whoa, that's pretty weird. But I kind of really enjoy those types of environments where people are just genuine, authentic, and not afraid to express themselves.
Yeah, you're making me miss that because I too was also pretty much in the basement all the time. And it was nice to just hang out. I mean, I too actually managed to at least wear a couple of tie-dye shirts as well. So I still have them. And my wife always nags me every time I wear them at home. That being said, I wasn't that crazy out there. I was just, studious one. Yeah, there was kind of a nice contrast, right, between that, freedom and creativity out there, and also like, the rigor that you kind of putting yourself through. And what's interesting is that there you become a computer engineer, right? At Palm, at Volkswagen, in gaming. A company is acquired by Walmart Labs. At social local services for a solid 8 years in SF in the Bay Area. So what was that like? Across a spree of startups.
Yeah, I sort of started out at big companies and got smaller over time. And yeah, what was it like? There's a lot of things I think about, but the first thing I think about actually when I think about my computer science career, especially since you brought up college, was college is really hard. Like, studious. I was maybe studious is a bit of a stretch, but we worked pretty hard in school. And I was really surprised the first couple of years of what working was like. And I actually felt really useless for a really long time in those jobs. So, you learn school, you get your good grades, and you expect to sort of hit the ground running at your first job. And that was very much not the case for me. But the one thing I'm really grateful for, and one of the reasons I personally got into computer science to begin with, is the opportunity to try lots of different things. So you just mentioned like e-commerce, gaming, automotive, self-driving cars. I've had a chance to do a lot of different things. And that's one reason why I love computer science or kind of learning how to code, because it really opens up the types of possibilities you can work in. I can't think of another industry where I could have tried so many different things.
Any crazy stories that you have from like working as a startup engineer? Any war stories?
Any war stories? I think one of the coolest projects I ever worked on, one of my favorite jobs was actually at that Volkswagen you mentioned. So it was at the Electronics Features Laboratory. That's the lab that made the first self-driving cars. I wasn't smart enough to work on that project directly, but I did lots of cool stuff. We made a robot that would sit in the car, and we had this like interesting. There's all these interesting things about cars, actually, about how we spend so much time. Well, in the U.S. especially, you spend so much time in the car, but it's not a fundamentally user-centric experience. So you take lessons on how to drive a car. The car doesn't really try to make it easier for you to drive. But one thing we're looking at in particular is things about safety. So today, like a lot of things in car safety are very like punishing. So it's like, let me beep this signal to annoy you until you put on your seatbelt, for example. And one experiment we worked on was we built a little robot that sat in your car dashboard and express emotions for you. So we actually had that robot look worried or scared when you didn't put in your seatbelt, for example. And we wondered, hey, or instead of the check engine light, we had the robot look sick and try to like give your car a personality and see how that influenced user behavior. And that was a pretty weird project. We worked on it with MIT Media Lab, actually. And they're responsible for all the kind of creativity there. But that was a fun project.
What was that? Like, did people like it or people didn't like it? What was the learnings from that? Social robotics.
People did like it. And so there have been a couple of products that have followed up from that. Ours was it was an R&D lab, so it was not really productionable. But I think the kind of one of the products that came out of it was little assistants for your car. So if you imagine, they later built like a small little kind of robot that would sit on your dashboard, or like a little toy that had some ability to emote as well. But I think you're kind of seeing like the next generation of that with the voice assistants and things like that, and really curious what will become.
Awesome. Well, that's awesome to hear. I'm so curious about, then the next stage, right? Which is, there you're in SFB area and then you decide to move to Vietnam, right? So there you are. So tell us what was going through your mind. What helped you make that decision at that point of time? I mean, obviously, I think there's a different decision between why you moved versus why you stayed, but why did you move?
Sure. So at the time, I was really enjoying working at different startups. And to be honest, I was fortunate enough to work at some startups that did okay. And it all looked very easy to me. When you're around someone who's good at what they do looks easy. But then you realize later how good that person was. So for me, I worked at a few companies, they did well. And I thought, hey, I could start my own company. As an engineer, you work pretty hard. I'm like, hey, I couldn't possibly take more hours that I'm putting in now. So I worked on various startup ideas, a lot of crazy ideas I don't talk about. We tried to start a dog walking startup. We tried to start a tool for personal trainers to train people better. We tried personal analytics around GitHub commits. We had a lot of different ideas. None of them really took off at the time. So basically, I was feeling a little discouraged. And actually, living in the Bay Area is also expensive. So after about a year and a half to 2 years of this, I realized that perhaps it was time for me to go back to working for someone. And that's when I decided, okay, right before I do this, I should try something different. And that's what kind of led me to choose Vietnam as a point. I originally only thought about staying here for a few months just to get something out of my system, to try something else. And that's how I ended up here. But then one thing led to another, and 6 years later, still here, happily working on CoderSchool.
That's amazing. And I've got to ask then, so how did you fall in love with CoderSchool, and why, take something that you knew so well, right? Because you know coding so well. You've been a coder for such a long time. You study it. You worked in it across multiple companies. So why did you decide to say, "Hey, let me take something I'm good at and start teaching it"? Was it something you were teaching before? What was the context of all of that?
Yeah, actually, so the context before that, there were two things that happened that made me really interested in coding education. One was I took a course at a coding school that's still around called CodePath, and they've been great supporters of CoderSchool, the founders there. But it's the first time I'd taken a course since college, and I'd take it maybe like 10 years after I graduated. And it kind of blew my mind because I was like, hey, this is really useful. And wow, I haven't learned anything new really in a classroom setting since university. And I thought that was kind of weird how you spend the first, 20 something years of your life basically full time student, and then you go from that to zero. And many people never go back. And so it was a really good experience for me. I enjoyed it a lot. And what I had learned there was iPhone programming. So despite having been like my first job out of college was working for this company called Palm, which actually made the first smartphone. There's a documentary about it now out. Actually, it's called the Handspring Trio at the time, and or Handspring Visor was it? But it's this company called Handspring that built which later became Palm, which built the first smartphone. So I worked there, and I made smartphones for the first couple years of my career, which is awesome. But I remember when the iPhone came out, and that caused a lot of waves in the industry. And eventually, of course, the iPhone has now won out. But even being like on the kind of vanguard of that, I never really learned how to program iPhone apps. And it wasn't until I actually sat down, took a course many years later that I was like, oh, now I know how to build iPhone apps. It had been all of those things I've always told myself, like, hey, I'll learn. But I never actually was able to complete the loop until I signed up for a course. So that was really interesting about how, so there's something about taking a class that just works and helped me accomplish something I've been thinking about for almost like a decade, how to build apps properly. At the same time, so I had that really great educational experience. I also started teaching as a result part-time for a friend's coding school. So coincidentally, one of my housemates had founded one of the first online coding schools called block.io and raised a bunch of money for it. And I became one of the mentors there and I really enjoyed the experience. That was also almost a decade ago. And I still actually get updates from some of the people on LinkedIn saying that they're moving up, senior engineers, VPs of engineering now. It's so cool. But that really helped me also kind of work with people and see the potential for change. People can totally change their careers, learn coding in 3 to 6 months, and become totally new people. I thought that was cool. And so when I came to Vietnam, these things kind of collided. Where in 2015, when I first arrived, the biggest trend worldwide was actually started by a Vietnamese person. It was the game Flappy Bird. So if anyone remembers that game, it's that little bird that would pop on your screen that just took over the world, like in a way that's like kind of never been done since, actually, I would say. But that was created by like some Vietnamese guy in his parents' basement in Hanoi. And so at the time, there's so much interest around iPhone programming as a result. It had been what I had just learned and started teaching. So those things kind of collided, and I opened an iPhone programming course as the first course at CoderSchool.
Wait, so Flappy Bird, was that the same time frame?
Yeah,
Did it trigger a wave of people wanting to learn coding? Is that what
yeah,
happened?
I really think so. People were like, "Hey, this like Flappy Bird, this guy's making like this, like such a big impact in the world and tons of money. And how do you build stuff like this? Is it hard?" And people just sort of like started getting really interested in it. And if you really think about it, and like I'm sort of adding my own inference here, but it's like, whoa, that guy did it. Well, I could do that too, and it really hit home. And the fact that the next huge world phenomenon could come from Vietnam or anywhere, just by one person, I think is really powerful and kind of helped inspire a lot of people.
So now I gotta ask, for that first class, do you remember what projects they were trying to build? Were there people trying to make Flappy Bird clones?
So actually, like for the marketing for that class, we were trying to get people to sign up. Anyone who's tried to learn programming probably knows like the first thing you try to learn is a to-do list, things like that. So we'd run like workshops, like, hey, learn how to build a to-do list with iPhone program, iOS. Those did okay. People were sort of like signed up and would come. But then we tried hey, build your own Flappy Bird iOS workshop, like sold out immediately. People are like, whoa, I can do that. And it's actually like really easy to build. So I think today even you could build something. Anyone can build Flappy Bird in like 2 hours. at least like a basic version.
I am so excited to put a link code to your Flappy Bird workshop in this
Sure. I
description
gotta
after
dig it
this.
up. Yeah.
It's like I'm listening to this podcast. I can learn 2 more hours of listening after this, and I can learn how to do Flappy Bird. So there you are. You learned how to take something that you've already been passionate about for a long time, which is coding, and now you're taking that into teaching. And one interesting thing is, of course, is that everybody can teach. It's just that not everybody makes it a startup, right? So, why make it a startup, right? Why make it something be large or try to be large or try to scale it or be huge, right? Versus keeping it small. There's so many small coding academies around the world for the, one city, for the one district, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think people have different ways of going about different startups, and everyone's journey is a little bit different. Mine already, I think you're kind of getting the sense that I was a little bit like not planned from day one. Like I didn't come to Vietnam with the idea to do this, and I kind of fell into it. But the other thing, when I reflect on it, it's like why a startup? I think it's like finding a startup is maybe not so different than achieving mastery in anything. And for example, like how do you become a great podcaster? How do you become a great author or artist? There's a saying that's you say just stay on the bus. Meaning like if you think about how a bus lines work in a city, imagine you're in the middle of the city. You stay on the bus, and for the first first half an hour or so, first 10 stops, they're all the same. So you go to the same places. Everything's very similar. So, for example, you're starting a company or starting a podcast. It's not nothing special really happens in that first little phase. But you stay on the bus long enough, and eventually, like they filter out, and you get farther and farther away, and you start to get to places that no one else can go to. And that's very much how I feel like my experience with CoderSchool was. Yeah, at the beginning of Flappy Bird Workshop, anyone can do that. And in fact, there are many people. But how do you stick with it? How do you stay with it? And how do you sort of start discovering more and more about education, more and more about how you can train people at scale, or how to really deliver great experiences? And that's like what I think I'm glad I stuck with it, because like now I feel like we are starting to get out of the main city and starting to get into really exciting places now.
As you build that out and scale it out, what does it allow you to teach in a way that you couldn't teach before, right? Because before this, you were teaching it yourself or you're teaching in a small group format. I guess what are you getting to do now as, a school, as a startup that I couldn't have gotten before as a student? What makes you special that makes me say, yes, I want to learn from not Charles as a person, but Charles as a founder, as a leader of this organization in terms of his spirit and ethos and his differentiation, right, as a product.
Yeah, and I wish I could explain all the different things we're trying to do. We're definitely still searching for what to build, but what we always want to do, we've wanted to do this since day one, was provide opportunity for everyone, everywhere. So part of the thing that really attracted me when I came to Vietnam was I realized that, hey, like people didn't have access to quite the same quality of experience in education that I did. I talked about that great class I took about iPhone programming. That class didn't exist here. And as a result, like people just didn't have the opportunity to learn. And so that's what we've really been focusing on. And how we do that, I think there's a lot of pieces to it, but kind of at the big picture, one thing I really like about education and reason why I think a lot more people should be working on it, it's like the world's largest service industry. So Peng at Monks Hill has a thesis about what you guys invest in. And it's about, hey, we like to use technology to disrupt service industries. And I think that's one of the theses of many of the startups at Monks Hill. But if you think about it, like education is one of the few service industries that affects everyone. There's like, an audience of 7 billion out there. And for such a business, it's like one of the least customer-centric things as well. So it's the same observation I had about cars, but education as well too. Like there's not a lot of focus on how to make a student succeed and who ultimately rests on. So for example, like I think one of our earliest students for our course, our full-time course that helps you become an engineer, he was a student at the top university here, Science University, and he was a mechatronics major. He was doing well, but junior year, he discovered that he really liked programming. He wanted to build software instead of sort of robots and mechatronics stuff. But the university wouldn't let him change his major. he had to finish these credits at this time. And to me, that like blows my mind that this institution, right, you're paying these people for this thing and you're going through all the things they do, but they won't let you like kind of work to find a good solution to what you want. Like as a customer, you just want to work on cool stuff and get a career building the knowledge you need to do what you want to do. And so when I think about these types of systems, that's what really inspires me at CoderSchool. Is like, hey, how can we really provide people what they really want, and how can we listen to them? I don't like to think of like when a student fails at CoderSchool, like it happens from time to time. That student somehow isn't succeeding. It's not because the student's lazy. It's not because something's wrong with that. It's like, oh, how can we provide a better experience? And that's what I really hope we can bring to education moving forward. Is how can we really have a customer-centric experience that delivers what people want?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's really rare. And I think the truth is that education is not customer centric because it's about getting as many people through from point A to point B at the lowest cost possible in a very batch format. And what's interesting is that you are bringing high quality education and making that accessible. What's interesting from my personal perspective as well is that, you've also noticed that there's that wave of democratization in terms of like coding education in the US. But what is that level of democratization for the middle class or the lower class in the US is actually still priced way too high for emerging markets across the world. For example, Vietnam, right, still priced for the upper class effectively. And so it's interesting where I feel like you've actually been able to go one level deeper and say, actually, we can go, there's a huge white space where there are so many countries, the rest of the world from America's perspective, / the majority of the world from the majority of the world's perspective, really needs a coding education that is not US-centric, but is really developed for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I keep using the rest of the world. I hate using the word rest of the world because it shows a US-centric dynamic, and I hate myself so much.
No, but I mean, but it's absolutely what we need to be thinking about. I mean, the quote unquote rest of the world, but that's where all the innovation is going to happen. I mean, you get the really high level metrics about what automation is going to do for the world, how the future of work is going to change. All that's going to happen out here. And so I think the changes will be much, much larger and much more important, large sweeping changes. And that's where the education start. But I also think like, if you think about how these trends could happen, like I would love to export this to the US later, right? We can build a better experience that's more efficient under like a different set of constraints. Like there's the saying about how constraints breed innovation. I think we have really interesting constraints here that we can learn from.
Let's talk about constraints breeding innovation. What does that mean to you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you, particularly with education, you talked about how we can make accessible. It's a big kind of thing for us. But if you have like the ability to pay like $100,000 a year for education, I think that's a very different question than how can you do it for, let's say, a tenth of that price, or for 10 times more people, or even for things like when people don't have great internet connections. Like, how are you going to solve these problems? Or when people don't have the right background. And there's just like all these problems. And when you have, I think the other thing too is like when you're kind of in a more developed market, you have a lot of advantages that let you focus on just a small part of the problem. So here, like there's a big reason why there aren't enough engineers.
I think what you're saying here is there's an innovation dynamic that's happening regardless, right? And the constraints are enabling an aspect of it that is pretty rare. I guess when you think about Vietnam as certain constraints, what constraints about Vietnam do you think is the set of constraints that you think would breed or be relevant for America later? I guess one is GDP per capita. Would that be one aspect of it? Like, the price points. You're designing for lower set price points. I mentioned that earlier. I'm so curious. Maybe.
I think also a big one here is it's a pretty big deal when someone takes a CoderSchool class. So I think in the US a lot, like people will be like, oh, I'll try like learning coding, see how it is. But here at CoderSchool, it's terrifying to me because like if we let someone down, if someone really kind of puts down, which is still a substantial investment in something that doesn't work out, it's quite disastrous. It can be quite bad. So I think there's a lot of responsibility here, but at the same time, like it's such a high reward thing. So here we have the ability to really kind of like 10x an earning potential over a lifetime, or even just like 2x or 3x within 6 to 12 months. So the economic impact we have is so large that I get excited about that. It's like, great power, great responsibility type of dynamic. But that's what always like kind of drew me to CoderSchool at the beginning, or like kind of solving problems out here. Like these are actually, if you think about kind of the marketing around coding is really interesting. I think in the US, actually, you get a lot more about aspirational stuff. Like, hey, learn coding, it's the future, it's really cool. And I think that's really true. I just told you about how much I love coding because it allowed me to explore so many different diverse interests of mine and learn a lot. At the same time, like I really like that in a more emerging market, it's much clearer what people want. It's like, hey, I want to create value. I want to have a better career. I want to make more money. I have a better job. And it's really actually refreshing. And the way our marketing works is it's more about that. So at CoderSchool, we guarantee that you'll get a job within 6 months after graduating in IT. And so that speaks really a lot better to the market out here. And I like that. It helps. Our students are motivated. They know what they want, and they go get it.
Awesome. I love how you've been learning and been able to use that constraint as a way to actually give you more freedom, right, to innovate around those. And I love that aspect of it. Actually, on that note, what's interesting as well is that also Charles gotten a chance to observe you not only learn about the constraints of coding and education, but also learn about fundraising as a founder as well, which is a whole new skill set that both you and I had no idea 10 years ago, right? And so what would you say that you've learned about fundraising as a process over time?
Yeah, I have to preface with this with like I'm not an expert, clearly, possibly just super lucky, but I've learned a few things that I share with people. The first is that as an early founder, you're often very focused on what the solution you're building, how well your solution works, and that's very important. But really, the piece that I never thought about as much before fundraising was what the opportunity size is. So for most venture, if you're looking for venture-backed funding, mostly they're trying to make a big win. So they talk about unicorns, but it's really serious. Can this grow into $1 billion business? And that's almost a prerequisite. If you build something that's wonderful, that works great, but doesn't have the possibility to grow into that huge business, it's probably not a good fit for venture capital. And that's nothing against how good your product is or how good your team is. That's just like the kind of dynamics of the market you're in. So I think I learned a lot about that. The second thing I think you learn is how to evaluate what kind of investors you want and what draws you to certain people. And the thing that I found myself really drawn to, and one reason I'm so happy to be working with MHV, is I really want to work with people that understand what it's like to build companies, and specifically how hard and slightly irrational it is to build your own company. My favorite is, and this is my one life hack on how to fundraise, by the way, is most investors or VCs are also like very prolific speakers or writers out there. So just like Google them on YouTube, you could search for them on YouTube or Google their blog and try to read what they say and see how you feel and see if anything resonates with you. Before talking to Peng, I watched several of his talks on YouTube, and I was like, oh wow, this guy has some really good points. It gives you something to talk about when you meet the person. But specifically so one of our partners is Justin at Monks Hill. And in your last podcast, he said something to me that was like, oh yeah, this is why I like working with this guy. Your opening quote, the cold open for your podcast, was Justin talking about how he got shingles, this horrible disease, because he was so stressed out running his company. And first of all, I don't think he went into detail about how horrible that disease is, right? Because like, I haven't had it, but I had a friend who had it, and my understanding is like, your skin hurts. Your skin is everywhere, so it's super unpleasant. But then like Justin followed that up with saying that sometimes he misses the build part of a company. Like, I miss the build. And so I think that's like almost the profile of person I would like to work with, is someone who went through it, knows how terrible it is, but still misses it and wants to help other people get through it. So that was like the thing that I was like, oh, this is the type of person I want to work with. And when fundraising, I think you not only you want to be able to choose your money, but you also like have a better chance of getting funded by people you vibe with, because they'll probably vibe with you and understand what you're trying to do and be more likely to support you.
A lot of truth there. Definitely triggering the part where you're making me feel like I'm missing the build as well.
There you go. So you're one of those people too.
So
You're also ran a company, CEO. Like you get it, and I think that's so important to me. Other people have different opinions, but that's what was
yeah.
important to me.
So there you are, and you say that you have that fundraising life hacks, right? Which is one was like really thinking about $1 billion opportunity size. The second, of course, is making sure to Google, right? The partner and see if they resonate. Let's talk about the second one first, and then we'll talk about the first one later, which is making sure that you resonate with the partner. What does it mean to resonate with a partner? So and you talk about how Justin resonated with you because having a former operator is important to you. Why does it matter? What does it mean to resonate? Why does resonate matter? Why not just take someone with money from your perspective? Because there's like another way to look at it, right?
Absolutely, and money is important. And I never understood that, and perhaps I have much to learn on this. But I think just like then the easy answer is one: people who you resonate with are more likely to actually give you money in the first place because you can communicate with them, you can explain your vision. There's some people out there who will never get what you're trying to do, and just that kind of resonation is like a shortcut to that. But the second part is you really do work with that person. So over time, when you're running a company, you need every help you can get. It's like running a company is hard. Everyone who's there to help you with it is like a massive resource. And if you happen to have someone who's at a VC, they have a lot of influence over your company potentially, but also they just have a wealth of experience. So someone whom you resonate with is going to be more likely to be able to communicate to you their insights and their advice on how to tackle the challenges of running a company.
Why is that important? I guess kind of going back to the 5 whys, not the Volkswagen way, I guess, but being able to do that and build the company with you and be able to help you.
Well, I think just like the very easy answer is, once you take funding from someone, you have a certain like responsibility to that person, which you should. If that person wants different things than you do, it'll be increasingly difficult to fulfill what that person wants while also doing what you want. And anytime that happens, it's a tax on what you have to do. If I have to like sit there and make my investor monthly update look really nice, or kind of have to tweak it and can't just say exactly what I want to say, that's time I've spent not doing real work, in my opinion. So kind of cutting down that is big. The second is, I think, really you want the work that happens is during bad times. So during good times, anyone can give you advice. Just keep doing what you're doing. Good job, Charles. Like we've always believed in you. Actually, when you really want to lean on people for help is when things are bad. When like, hey, like COVID just hit. What should I do? For example, I think every kind of startup went through that. And the startups that had people that they could communicate openly with, much more likely to find solutions, much more likely to talk openly about things. You can only hide problems for so long at a company. They'll eventually come out. And so the more comfortable you are with someone, or the better they understand you, I think the quicker you can get to that solution.
Wow. I think kind of hit the nail on the head here, right? Which is, it's not just about choosing the right VC, but to some extent there's a tax, right? When you're not with the right VC, because you have the right to investor update the perfect way, right? And you're making me resonate because you're triggering some memories in me.
I see.
About some investor updates I've written, where I wrote it the right way, right, in retrospect, versus the way I would have written if I was really the way I would describe it to the management team, right? And that was an invisible tax that cost time, and the converse of that, like you said, was, the tax was not just in terms of the friction, but also tax on what could have been if we had clear communication in terms of, problem solving, right? And actually getting something done.
Yeah. And like just I will say, like as a plug, like, I have a monthly update with Justin and Michelle, my two partners at MHV on Tuesday. And I'm looking forward to it. It's not like, oh no, like I need to like do this thing. It's like, I'm genuinely looking forward to it. And that's the kind of energy that I hope that you want. As a founder, you want things that give you energy a lot more than things that take away energy from you. And so if your investor's taking energy away from you, you're gonna have to pay that somewhere.
Oh, the energy tax. So I guess the key takeaway is like when you meet an investor, you think to yourself, is this person going to give me energy, or is this person going to tax energy from me to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the same for even like hires at your company, like, anybody that you work with. I think, and again, like you're giving me energy now because you understand it, right? Because I'm like, oh man, like Jeremy gets what I'm talking about. But like, yeah, as a founder, like your energy is arguably one of your most precious resources. I can work hundreds of hours a week if I have the right energy.
What are the energy taxes? Are there ways to sense or test, what the energy tax would be in differentiating? Because I guess there are two aspects to it, right? Which is not every founder gets to choose investors because, they go out to market and people get multiple investors. Some people only get
Yeah,
one investor. Some people, lots of people, frankly, the majority will get zero investors.
correct.
So a lot of people don't have a choice, right? And then, so I guess the question then is like, it feels almost like a privilege, right, to be able to choose investors that help you with energy rather than tax you. I'm just wondering how you think about that, from your perspective.
Yeah, like I don't want to make it sound like CoderSchool had like a million people to choose from, and it was like I had to interview everyone. I mean, they're definitely, yeah, not everyone can choose much, but I think the other thing I kind of realized too is, I mean, people talk about how the goal of a company is not to fundraise, right? The goal of a company is to deliver to customers, to build this. Your goal is to build something cool, and so if you're going to fundraise from someone, perhaps you'll have to make that judgment in your head. But like, if it's a huge energy suck from you, you feel like it's not really going to help, like you're just kind of delaying the inevitable at some point, or really just kind of actually like hurting your chances of success. I think there's always alternatives. You're never forced to fundraise, no matter what you think. There's the old Paul Graham saying of like startups don't die, like startup suicide, right? So you always have the chance. You always can fight to live, and so I think that's what I recommend. People sometimes feel like they have no choice but to accept the funding from someone they're not keen on. And sometimes it's the right choice. To be clear, the energy from the money will offset other things, but it's not always. You never are forced to do it.
That is very true. And I think on that similar note, we go back to that thing we promised to talk about, which is also that $1 billion market size. And when you said that, I also was reminded someone was asking me last night, and she was asking me, does it have to be a $1 billion market size to be a success? And I figured, and you kind of mentioned that as well, a $1 billion market size is just not a VC backable thing as well, and it's not necessarily a bad thing as well. So how do you kind of land on that thinking now? You've had that conversation, that thinking, So yes, you have to be a $1 billion market size to get VC capital, but do you have to be a $1 billion opportunity? How do you think about it? Should you write $1 billion in a slide? Should we aim for $1 billion? Where do you land on that?
Yeah, and now I answer that with like an analogy from my life, which is, and you may have had the similar experience, Jeremy. Asian parents, like, did your parents want you to be a doctor or a lawyer growing up?
Yeah, my mom wanted me to be a doctor. Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lawyer was too noisy, so.
Okay, so my parents wanted me to be a doctor too. They bought me like little doctor toys when I was a little kid and stuff. That was very much their goal, and part of it is because my dad's a professor, PhD, super smart guy. Went to Stanford in the '80s from Korea. It's amazing. But like one thing that was really interesting to me is like in high school, one of our teachers had retired to his regular job to come teach high school. Super cool guy, Mr. Norton. Taught physics, one of my favorite classes. But he shared that before he was teaching high school, he was the manager of a grocery store, like a Safeway. And he was like, oh, and we make, for some reason, he like shared how much money he used to make as the manager of a Safeway. And I was like, you can make $150,000 like managing a Safeway. And then like I sort of started asking around, and like there was, if you own a McDonald's, like if you buy and own McDonald's, you're making like $1 million a year, almost, if it's a good McDonald's. And like sort of like my career at the point was like, wait, like I want to be a professor or something, and professors don't make that much money by a long shot. Even doctors, most doctors don't make that much money as running McDonald's. And I'd always had this like view, like, Charles, you must be a doctor, or you must like get a PhD, you must get a master's. And I never even considered that there's this other, like, there's way richer people doing stuff. And so I never considered it. And now I kind of think that's the same thing with venture capital. Like, building a VC startup is kind of like the doctor of the startup world. Like it's what everyone thinks that they want to do. It's like the kind of respectable way. Your mom's going to talk about you and like, oh, my son's a doctor, like, oh, or my son got VC funded. It seems very similar. It's a status symbol. But if you think about how to actually like make impact or make money or do things, it's like it's definitely not the only way. And for a long time, I sort of had this view that like being a doctor is more valuable than running a Safeway, but it's not at all. And I think that's how it analogized to this VC versus not VC.
Amazing. I think the way you described that, I think that's a perfect way, because it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just left or right, it's just a different path. Amazing. So on that note, I'd love to wrap up this podcast. I think we
Sure.
can go on for another hour, it feels like. But I'd love to paraphrase the 3 big themes that we got from here. The first is, of course, thank you so much for sharing all of the learnings that you had as a startup engineer, from UC Berkeley to your stories building social robotics for sad or happy little cars, making emoji faces, to where you are, doing a bunch of startups and giving one last shot and going off to Vietnam and turning out that you got to convert your passion for coding into something that you actually love teaching, and scaling that out to CoderSchool. So it's just amazing to convert that experience to being able to change your passion into your work, right? And secondly, thank you so much for actually talking briefly about I think constraints versus innovation. I think you talk about it in different domains. Obviously, you talked about it from the framework dynamic. We talked about it as well from the context of Vietnam and the US. We talked about it in the context of how you see it at CoderSchool, about what you're doing and designing to make it much more compelling for people in Vietnam and for other emerging markets and Southeast Asian countries across the world. And lastly, thank you for the knowledge that you dropped. And I think you were very self-deprecating about the fact that you got lucky and so on and so forth. I just think you had a very mature and professional point of view about what you call fundraising life hacks. About, I think, first of all, being thoughtful about the $1 billion market size, not from a moral, $1 billion good, $1 million bad dynamic, but really looking at it as it's a choice to make from a personal decision. And secondly, being thoughtful about choosing your VC partner in terms of whether they're going to help you be an energy tax that slows you down, and versus someone that you're excited to write your investor update and be clear about communication and problem solve with, and de-risk the company together and create an amazing company for customers and employees together. So on that note, Charles, thank you so much for coming on the MHV podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the MHV podcast, please share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Go to www.monkshill.com for more founders' journeys, company building advice, and insights into regional tech trends.